Hi, I'm Alison from Burningsuit, and in this third video we're going to look at how the Microsoft Power BI Key Influencers visual can be used to analyse the Strictly Come Dancing data. So in the previous two visuals we've looked at using the Key Influencers visual to analyse the Strictly Come Dancing data by looking at the individual judges' scores. And so we've used as our metric in the Analyse bucket the scores column from the scores table. But there is another way to analyse our data, and that is not to look at individual judges' scores, but to look at the total score for each dance out of 40. Now we do record that measurement in the dancers table. So if I can just find that for you now, just look at the dancers table. So in our dancers table, we have the total dance score. So this is the measurement we're going to be using in our measure. So if I just return now to my report, we have a measure that looks at the average of the total dance score. And the reason we need to use the average is so that we can compare like for like. We can compare contestants and dancers, etc. But for all intents and purposes, we can think of the average dance score as just being the dance score for each dance. So this is the metric that I'm going to be now using in my Analyse bucket. But before I do that, I'm going to copy the visual that uses the column. And the reason I'm going to do that is so I can compare the analysis I get when using the column to the analysis I get when using the measure. So I'm just going to do that now. I'm just going to copy the visual. I'm just going to put them side by side. And now in this visual here on the left, this visual here, we will place the measure. I'm just going to do that now. So currently it's got a column in the Analyse bucket, but I'm just going to find that average dance score measure and place it here in the Analyse bucket. And the first thing that we can see is that the visual has failed. Now the reasons for this I'm going to explain in more detail later, but what we need to do to fix it is to look at the fields in the Explain By bucket and identify any numeric fields that have been using in the Explain By influencers. And we can identify here that we've got age. And what we need to do with age is make sure that we set that to Don't Summarise. So when we're using measures, any fields in the Explain By bucket, any numeric fields must be set to Don't Summarise. Otherwise the visual will fail. And now at least we've got something showing in the visual over here on the left that is using the measure. But here's the thing. If we understand that our measure simply comprises the 4 different scores from each judge, we can appreciate that the measure is derived simply from the 4 different judges' scores, and therefore we should expect the Key Influencers visual to return much the same results, whether it uses the measure that simply sums up the scores or whether it looks at the individual scores. But we can see that that is not the case. I have a different analysis here in the visual that's using the measure to the visual that's using the column. And there's something else that I find a little bit disturbing. If I now look at the percentages that are being used in this visual, if I just look, for instance, at the percentage for dancing last, we can see that the dancers that dance last comprise 28.14% of the data. But if I now look in this visual and look at the percentage of dancers that comprise dancing last, we will see that this time it's only 10.56. So which of these percentages am I expected to believe, and why am I getting different results? Well, the key to this is to understand the nature of the measure and to appreciate that measures by definition group and aggregate. We can't prevent that behaviour. But when we use a column, we can go and get the analysis to look at all the individual scores within the source table. And again, we can identify that as being true by just looking at what's happening to this scores column in the analysis bucket. Because if I analyze the summarization that's going on, I can see that by default, any column we put into the analyze bucket of the Key Influencers visual when we're using the column will be set to Don't Summarize. So in other words, my visual that uses the column looks at the row level granularity of the data, whereas the visual that's using the measure is looking at aggregated data. Now we can have a closer look at this by converting these visuals into table visuals, where we can actually look at the data that's being used to perform the analysis. And I've done that here in this page called Data Behind the KI. So I'm just going to move to that page now. And here in the table on the left, we've got the data that's being used by the Key Influencers visual that uses the measure. And in this visual, we can see that our data is grouped and aggregated. So it's grouped by gender, by age, and by first and last. And then the average score is calculated for that group. So we can see that behind any of these rows in the visual, we've got a number of different dances. So let's just take this row here. So here we're grouping contestants by female contestants that are 19 and that happen to dance in the middle. And so that group of contestants got an average score of 33, and that comprises 15 rows in my dancers table. But what the visual is looking at is it's looking at the rows of this visual and not the rows of the underlying table. So in other words, you can see here that I've just counted up the number of rows in this visual, and this is what is being used as my data points. And then also done is looked at the number of rows that equate to dancing last. And down here in the total row, we simply added up these rows. So the number of rows in the visual is 199. This is not the number of rows in the underlying table. The number of rows in the visual that comprises our last dance is 56. So this is why we are getting the percentage of 28.14. But if we now compare the visual that uses the column, we can see that the scores that are being, or data points that are being used, equates the total number of scores within the underlying table. So here in the visual, I've got both 7,768 rows in the visual, and this is the same number of rows in the underlying table. So how do we fix this? How do we get our measures table to behave like a column? Well, what we can do is we can simply force this visual that groups and aggregates to simply have groups that comprise just a single row. And we can do that by finding the row granularity of the dancers table. And to do that, we can just use an index or primary key number. So I've done that in another sheet. So let's just move now to this data fix sheet. And we can now see what we've done here in this table on the left. So you'll see what I've done is I brought in a unique identifier for each row of the dancers table. And so now we can see that the total number of rows in the visual equates to the same number of rows in the dancers table. And now we can see that we're getting the correct percentage, which should be 10.56, which we can see now we can calculate here when we are looking at the row granularity. Is going to be the same percentage as when we look at here the row granularity of the scores table. So in other words, when we're using measures, we need to force the measure to analyze at a lower grain than would naturally happen within the visual. So armed with this knowledge, I can go back to my Key Influencers visual, and I can go to the visual that's using the measure, and I can use the expand by bucket. So this is what this expand by bucket is for. It's only available if you're using measures. And what it does is it forces the analysis to look at a much lower granularity on the data than otherwise would happen by the natural behavior of the measure to group and aggregate. So if I now do a similar thing, or the same thing, which is to take the dance key and put it into the expand by, and I now go and analyze these percentages, I will see that they are consistent. If I now look at the percentage that takes up the dancing last scores, I can see here in the visual that uses the measure, that now tells me it's 10.56, which is the same now as the visual that uses the column, which is also 10.56. So I'm now getting my measures visual to look at the same granularity as when previously I was using the column. So this is the key to using measures when you in the Key Influencers visual. It's not that you can't or shouldn't, it's just to be aware of how the Key Influencers visual arrives at the analysis. So when you're using measures, the Key Influencers visual will be looking at aggregated data, and the data points you see are the data points in the visual, not the data points in the underlying table. Whereas when you use a column, the column always looks at the lowest granularity. It always looks at each row in the underlying table that you're analyzing. So there we go. That's a look at using measures in the Key Influencers visual. So let's just summarize now where we've got to with looking at how our contestants perform and what key factors influence our contestants getting a better score. So what we can say, whether we use a measure or a column, is that if a contestant is female, a contestant is 31 or less, and the contestant dances last, that contestant is going to have a much better ride or journey through the competition than any other contestants. So there we go. That's our Key Influencers visual looking at our Strictly Come Dancing data.